Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Perfect Prey. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I have a story that I think these are conversations that we need to continue to elevate, and they are the most heartbreaking stories. But the problem is that we've always been uncomfortable talking openly about how domestic abusers inflict their harm. And there's so much shame surrounding domestic abuse. And I am extremely grateful to have Leah Moses here today to talk about Om and Om's law and the experiences that she had through the process of being in a partnership with someone who's an abuser. And unfortunately, again, this conversation is going to be overwhelming and triggering, as most of our conversations are, but they're necessary conversations to have. So thank you so much for being here, Leah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So if we were to, I think a lot of listeners are always curious. Isn't it interesting how even when we suffer this abuse, we often sit in a space of gaslighting ourselves. We can't believe how bad it is. And hearing other people's stories can be very validating. And for people who are living this right now, this experience of abuse, can you just share a little bit about what that relationship was like? And also when you begin to notice, wow, this isn't a healthy space, I'm going to separate. And then, of course, I think you were engaged in family court for, am I right, a decade?
Over a decade.
Yes.
Mhm,
Okay. All
mhm,
right. So
mhm.
that'd be great if you could share a little bit about your story.
Sure, it's always challenging to package this kind of life experience because not because we want to reduce each other to just one part of our life story, but because it's so complex. So just like you mentioned, relationships are vitally important to us as humans. Relationships affect our health, they affect our decisions and our trajectory and our paths, and we affect each other. Yeah, I think that when I look back, I have what I'm sure many others in similar situations have, which is massive amounts of regret. And oh, if I had only done it this way, or if I'd only done it that way. And I do have to say that after Mother's Day weekend of 2023, when I learned that Ohm's father had killed him, it was a whole new world for me. And at that moment, it felt like everything came to a halt. This over a decade of working in family court to get my children safe, that one goal that I had of more than anything else, more than any professional goal, more than any other personal goal. There was really nothing else in my life more important than getting my children to safety. And when you have one goal and all of a sudden it is completely turned inside out, it almost feels, who am I now? And even though I am a professional in medicine, I'm a professional artist, there's so many other sort of hats that I could put on and efforts that I've made in my life to make myself an expert in certain areas. My most beloved title has always been a mother. And so sometimes I'll describe this experience in my life as mothering in violence. So I did not have reproductive decision making authority over my own body. My three pregnancies were not my own decision, and that's very difficult, I think, for many people to say out loud. It's what drove me to medicine and to try to help with that idea of the reproductive coercion portion. That I think when I look at the package, I could say that there was one moment where I landed myself in the YWCA basement in Salt Lake City. And it was this back and forth. Should I leave? I don't know. And I had made plans and thought about it. Ohm was a toddler. And as I looked at the whole scenario and started realizing more and more that things like this was not a normal situation to live in, they handed me that power and control wheel, the classic Duluth model document that we've all had a chance to look at, and I could not believe that someone mapped out my life. You look in all the different categories, the financial and the physical and all of the different control factors. And even though that model is not perfect, it gave a framework and vocabulary to what I had been experiencing. And in some ways, that was a like quite an empowering tipping point for me. Now that was the second or third that was the first formal time that I left, but certainly like ninth or 10th informal time that I had tried to consider a way out. And with coercive control patterns, there's the financial control too. So you're always concerned about resources. And then in my particular situation, it was someone who had a very extensive understanding of psychology and was very clear on what his goals were, and that was to control me like at any cost. So I think that's something important to recognize. When Om was a baby, I did everything I could to protect him from abuse. There was just no escape from the volatile behavior. He would back us into corners, and I would shield Om from the punching the wall and all the things that you can imagine. But that was on top of also the other abuse that I experienced. So I fast forward a couple of years, and at one point I tried to file and try to get a protective order. Of course, there was not enough evidence, and the courts were demanding hospital reports, and I had none. And I started to believe maybe that's the only way out is a broken arm. Certainly not just one black eye. They probably require two. That and with I think the reasoning and the understanding that I had at the time, I look back and think I did everything that I could at every step of the way. I can say that out loud right now to you, but there are those middle of the night moments where you can't sleep and think, what else could there have been? That's the protective parent in us talking, right? That deeper baseline, like real human response to a wildly abnormal, scenario.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you said so many poignant things here. Mothering violence for me. Wow, that really resonates. It's because you have these beautiful children that the abuser knows matters so much to you that the violence actually accelerates and did post separation when you did finally have the ability. Is it ever an ability, by the way, to leave? Because honestly, it always gets worse, right? I think I always say escape is elusive because you might quote unquote escape the residential housing situation, but that doesn't mean you've ever escaped the abuse. You're obviously the worst case scenario in these types of situations. But you also, I think that power and control wheel is quite remarkable because you probably know my history. I've been doing this since I was 19, but I teach on the domestic abuse power and control wheel every single semester to my college social work students. Never thought I was a victim because there was no physical violence. And I wasn't. And then one day I had this aha moment. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm experiencing all of that but physical violence. So to your point, though, sometimes victims are like, please, like if I just had a bruise, if I had something, maybe someone would be willing to actually hear me, believe me, protect me. Yeah, and protect my children to the point. Yeah, that's a lot.
I
So
know.
mm,
Yeah, it's
it's
just not that simple, right?
it's not. It's very
Leaving is
complex.
not that simple. And there's that classic, why does he do that? And then why doesn't she leave? And even in education, I do a lot of intimate partner violence screenings in my clinic work. And I teach to that as well. I just taught a whole group of primary care residents about this the other day. And as we talk about recognizing abuse and its many forms, and even some simple sort of universal education topics that I address in healthcare visits, it is amazing how few in like general public understand the different dynamics of abuse and how it crosses socioeconomic boundaries, certainly education boundaries. There's not a community really anywhere in the world, I'm going to say, from my understanding and from studies, that doesn't have some kind of issue or has not been affected by domestic violence. We know it's everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I often describe the statistic 35% of women suffer some form of violence in their lifetime across the world. So then, how many are suffering non-physical violence abuse? That number has to be because it starts with coercion and control, and then the physical violence may be like a last resort or a way to retain control. But then, how many children are living in these homes? So if it's 35 suffer violence, what do you think? I'm thinking it's probably close to 70% have suffered non-physical abuse and non-sexual abuse, we'll say. And then how many of these women have children? It feels to me like it's the number one problem in our world. It's literally the number one problem in our world. And because if we don't fix this problem, the children carry it to the next generation. And whether they fawn with abusive people and end up in abusive relationships, or frankly become really big fighters in relationships because they have so much trauma from their own experiences. And I can't believe that we're not talking about it more. But that's another conversation.
I think so too. Yeah, I think about it again in medicine, it's that allostatic load that we carry, and it's so heavy. It's really heavy. I really truly see that one of the only ways to lighten that load is to start talking about it and then continue talking about it and then continue to try to find solutions and find more solutions and continue to refine those solutions. That's what I mean. There are so many recent studies that show that even just talking about intimate partner violence or domestic violence or even child abuse can actually reduce rates in communities. And that's not magic. That's not a magic wand. It won't change right away. But I applaud you for your efforts in talking
Oh,
about it.
oh, and you too. And I think it's interesting because I have a clinical practice where we see clients who are suffering this kind of abuse. And it's a gamut, right? It's people like what you're doing, you're educating people so that they don't get engaged in these relationships. So, like, we have young people who are like trying to get out of an abusive relationship, don't have children, people who have children, people who are engaged in the divorce custody proceedings. We do some divorce custody coaching and things like that. And then the trauma informed therapy. But the reality is that it's very challenging to heal until you actually find community, until you actually realize that you're not alone, that other people get it. And to your point, that's why I think when you say just discussing it, just having conversations changes so much of our community mental health awareness, our physical health awareness. But the silencing has been going on for a long time. And even the idea that I think when we think about the statistics related to children who are, I guess the word is murdered by their parents, by that we're not really elevating that. And that is related to his desire to have control over the mother. Yeah.
Yeah, truly, I think for our situation, and of course, we are each our own experts of our own experiences. I would certainly say that was truly a final act of control. And then to take his own life afterwards, and that's something that's obviously next level as well. And we can all speculate on plans and intentions and all of that, but there were so many years that my children and I lived through that gave me hundreds of thousands of experiences that lead me to believe that control really truly was one of the serious roots of the problems that existed in, I think, his own psyche. And people can attribute it to mental health issues or substance or all kinds of other things. But you know, there's a lot of post-mortem ideas about picking through cases and finding out like what really happened and why would someone behave that way. And I applaud the attorneys and policy professionals who have dug through to try to find unravel, untangle, and go upstream and think, what can we do then to put in place to prevent these kinds of tragedies? And like, how does it get this bad? And that's probably been one of the questions that people have asked me over and over again in so many different scenarios. Your children bravely risked like kidnapping. In fact, they were kidnapped by their own father. Like, what about all of the abuse that was reported to CPS and other organizations? And why didn't law enforcement step in? And all of these gaps and pitfalls where people, quote unquote, should have stepped in. And I think a lot of it too is that we're working with, as protective parents, systems that were not designed truly to protect,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
No, the systems definitely seem to be broken for sure. And I love the fact that we have policies in place now in Utah that actually are supposed to safeguard children from these kinds of circumstances. I think as part of the problem is convincing people who are working within the systems how imperative these laws are, right? And how important it is for everyone to be trained and understand. And I think to your point, pivoting to the perpetrator, what do these people look like? How do they behave? And we can see this if we look at the trajectory, but why aren't we willing to 10 years in family court? Multiple
14,
experience.
actually.
Okay,
Yes,
so
yes,
more than
yes.
10 years. So multiple experiences of someone trying to exert power and control over you, of using the legal system. Yet at no point was there any accountability or very little accountability on the part of the perpetrator. he was given carte blanche to continue to control you in that way, and the systems allowed it. And that's the piece of, I hope these pieces of legislation, Ohm's law and other laws like it, are going to really create the shifts that we need. But I do think we need an openness, and I hate to be like an open-heartedness by people. And to the point, I think we need a lot of people working in the system who have actually perhaps experienced it in some way, because if you haven't experienced it, maybe you're not really capable of understanding those experiences. I don't know. It feels to me a little bit like there's, for many, not all, but for many, an inability to truly understand and empathize with the experiences of what's going on with, I'll call it mothering violence.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a big ask, I think, of survivors. And many of us, and I'll say us as this collective us, are at a place where we can speak out and are safe now to speak out. But many, and I would say probably most of us, are actually not. And so many of the cases and situations that we read about, and I'm not talking about like post fatality, those that are out there where it ends up being, I don't know, is it he said, she said, there's so much high conflict labeling and all of that too. I think that some of the most severe cases we actually don't know about that are going on right now because it is absolutely completely unsafe for the protective parents or the victims in those situations to be able to say, this is what's actually happening in my family. We're talking about kids who are, I have protective parents calling me all the time, contacting me in all kinds of different ways. And when I talk to the vast majority, there are so many different scenarios, and you could almost take out the name and then replace with the next one, just like you said in the beginning, as we're talking, there's almost like a template, this like coercive control template that is overlaid onto so many of these situations. But certainly we have some momentum now. I
Yes.
with Yeah, in not only in policy, but also there's social media momentum. Everyone's trying, I think, to do their best with the intention of we have no time to waste. Right?
Mhm.
There are children living this right now. And that's another reason why I thought I'm going to see what I can do within policy. When VAWA reauthorized in 2022, and there were those lines in for Caden's law that were included that looked like they were promising to help within family law statute that states could adapt. I actually went to lawmakers in Utah, and unfortunately, Ohm was killed after that, and then went back again. And it is really challenging to to accept the fact that it takes a fatality. A lot of times it actually takes like the final straw for other people to listen, for decision makers to listen. And I certainly like applaud survivors who are in this space. And I actually also applaud survivors who are not, who are doing their best in other spaces and in other ways, and maybe even just surviving, literally surviving.
Yes.
And if that is what we all look different as survivors. We're all doing different things in our own spaces. It may be surviving children that we must take care of. It may be just surviving ourselves and
Mhm.
overcoming like the day to day, getting out of bed. And like certainly no one has to be expected to post homicide in their family to move into policy. It's just for me, that was my way. And then also to really fight for reproductive rights of my patients and to be in spaces and places where I could use my voice and speak out because I had been silenced for so long. But I had the safety and the ability to do that. That is the most, I don't even have a descriptive word for it, like the most glorious, the most generous, the most loving gift that my child gave me was the freedom to talk. I can actually talk now, and I don't have to be silenced anymore. And I have so much empathy for those who are not yet in that space. And I hope that no one ever experiences a finality that allows them to enter that space. We always hope that it's some other way. But for those of us who are now on the other side of a filicide, I would say it's our duty to help ourselves first and then do what we can to help others. And that looks so different for each of us.
Entirely. Yeah, so different for each of us. Yeah. Some people, to your point, they can't advocate in this way, but this is what for you felt like a healing journey, especially since you had already started the process. I just wanted to point out for our listeners, just so they know that So, filicide is the murder of children. And also the idea that I know there was a research study, Diana Bartlow interviewed a lot of judges. I forget what year it is, but it was in the 2000s. And what she did is she tried to find out what their response was to a harm to a child in their community under their jurisdiction. And they literally thought that these were all anomalies. They didn't see that there was a pattern, that there was a character trait of abusers, that if they could really hone in on that, they could prevent these horrifying acts from occurring. So I think there's a level of perhaps education that's happening because of these laws, which is really fantastic. And I think that maybe people might want to hear a little bit about what it's like to engage in policy because some people say, what can I do? What can I do? And I often say, find a legislator in your state that you have noticed has an interest in child abuse, child sex trafficking, any of these types, social media with children, like any of those child-centered pieces of legislation. And if you can find that person and get them to latch on, that would be amazing. So, yeah.
I fully agree. So I'm also on the board of our state domestic violence coalition, and that's been a really meaningful opportunity for me. I had to be very quiet for a while, and I think that was truly, honestly, I believe that to my advocate friends in so many spaces, it was a complete and total shock. Many of them turned to me and said, I had no idea that it was this bad. And I just said, this is actually the norm. We usually don't know how bad it is because this is very closed doors. So I think you're right. Lawmakers are a really important contacts for us to have. In fact, through the Domestic Violence Coalition, we have a policy committee, and there is a public policy group that we've put together, and we're trying this out as like an interesting modality to be able to connect lawmakers in each of the geographic regions in our state with basically a survivor partner. So, someone who is safe enough or confident enough to speak out, maybe it's a group, but of them, but lawmakers are elected to represent their constituents. And why not create a systematic way for each of them to have a survivor partner, someone who can be a survivor expert, who lives in their area, and you don't have to be an executive director of a direct service provider.
No.
You don't have to be a formal court watch advocate or anything. Survivors have their own expertise and experience and authority on their own. But that was I think the magic, I guess I would say, of moving through Utah House Bill 272, which was really lovingly named Ohm's Law after my son. And it was truly the advocates that came together and also the different entities that worked together in our state in partnership. So that we had a fairly new lawmaker and then another experienced senator that came together to sponsor the bill. Our domestic violence coalition understood very clearly and actually pivoted to make family court issues or child protection issues one of the policy pillars. So that was a very important change. And I do credit Office on Violence Against Women that they helped with that revamping of VAWA to put for the first time in federal statute language that was meant to be helpful in private custody matters. And when we say private, sometimes people think like private school, but not so. It's actually anything that's not juvenile court, which means wards of the state kind of thing. So it gave hope, I think, to so many protective parents, including myself. And when we looked at adapting cadence law for my state, we kept really strong pressure on keeping the integrity of the language of the four different components of the law, which some listeners might be interested in. First is child safety, putting that very first, elevating child safety as the first priority of custody and parenting, that courts have to consider safety risks, including evidence of domestic violence. And that's what in the best interest of children actually means. And then expert testimony, making sure that those who are invited or brought in a case that, yes, there are different ways of saying that, brought in to give expert testimony at all in cases that involve domestic violence must be experienced in that area, have expertise, and then also experience with victims. Safe therapy was another very important component. We've heard about reunification therapy, and that's being relabeled and and given all kinds of different titles. But that's another important piece of this legislation too, is that any court-ordered therapy must be effective and have therapeutic value, be evidence-based. The other component, of course, is this idea of judiciary training and making sure that decision makers understand child abuse. And that's not just judges or commissioners or magistrates or whatever the label is in each state. That means custody evaluators. That means guardians ad litem. That means any quasi immune party that is involved in cases must have education on child abuse and domestic violence and understand coercive control.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
It's
mouthful.
it is a mouthful, but it's a really important piece of legislation. And I think part of the issue that I think so we're going to be hopeful about these laws. And we're going to hope that we can maybe get people who aren't doing their due diligence in protecting children. I always say it's very interesting to me that if you have a bias to protect children, it's almost career suicide. And that is to me the most like unbelievable thing that if that's what I want to do and I come to court proposing that a child's not safe with a particular parent, I may not be called back to do this work. And so we need it sounds Pollyannish, but I say we have to infiltrate the system with people who actually truly understand this, and we have to push these other people out. I'm not sure we're going to change the system otherwise. People say dismantle family court, do all these other things. I love that idea. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think what could happen is having more people in the system, protective mothers and fathers, people who care, doing this work. And eventually, a judge isn't going to be able to align with people who aren't doing the right thing, the integrity thing. It's also very astounding to me, and this is a whole nother conversation, is the ethical violations that are occurring every single day in family court and otherwise reunification therapy, repair, whatever you want to call it, all of these things. But I kind of would like to end on a positive note. So,
Okay, for sure. And I
um,
should say we had many stakeholders involved in creating that law, and I like shout out to the organizations that supported and those that are working so diligently in other states to try to lift up these models. There are medical professionals, there are child abuse professionals, there are like domestic violence providers and coalitions, and we need all of us.
yes.
We the children need all of us. They need all of us.
Agreed, agreed. Yes. And even just, I think it was yesterday or the day before in Arizona, there were about 30 protective mothers that were speaking out, and there were two legislators who were very much engaged in these open hearings about the unfair actions that are occurring in family courts. There is something going on. I think you would agree.
There is. Yeah, we're making changes, and for many of us in the states that have passed parts and pieces of this, now is the implementation.
Oh, it is.
Next level.
It is. We
Yeah,
have
yeah.
coercive control legislation in Connecticut. Now we just need to implement that legislation. Yeah. Of course, our hearts go out to you for the tragic loss of Om. And I can't even imagine how heartbreaking that is. But I'm grateful that you have been able to create such a very swift change in your state, and that obviously you're doing lots of other fantastic advocacy work to create. It's a ripple effect, and you're rippling a lot. So thank you so much.
Yes, of course. And my final word will be I really give all my credit to Om.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, Leah.
Thank you too.